Growing up, my family was the kind of picture perfect that made neighbors jealous. My mother, Lillian, was an accomplished attorney with a dazzling smile, the kind of woman people described as having it all. My father, Matthew, ran a successful consulting business and seemed effortlessly charming. Together, they were the definition of success. Our home in suburban Connecticut was pristine, with a perfectly manicured lawn and gleaming windows that reflected the ideals my parents projected. To everyone else, my parents were a power couple. To me, they were simply mom and dad, competent, busy, and, as far as I knew, happy. But perfection, I've learned, is often a mask. Looking back, there were moments that should have made me question the harmony I thought we had. There was the time, when I was 8, that I spilled juice on the white carpet in the living room. My mother rushed to clean it up, while my father stood silently in the doorway. His face was calm, but his words were sharp. "Lillian, how many times have I told you not to let her drink anything in here? This is why I can't have nice things." At the time, I thought nothing of it. Dad was strict about keeping the house immaculate, it was just how he was. Mom didn't argue, she never did, but she looked down at the carpet with a quiet sadness I didn't understand. As a teenager, I began noticing how little my parents seemed to connect outside of their public appearances. They rarely laughed together or sat close during family movie nights. Their conversations were functional, always about schedules or errands, never about anything deeper. "Your father's busy," Mom would say if I asked why he didn't join us for dinner. "He works hard for us." But even then, I wondered if that was the whole truth. One memory stands out vividly, a dinner party my parents hosted when I was 16. The house was filled with laughter and clinking glasses as their friends complimented the meal and admired the decor. My mother floated between the guests, her smile radiant but, to me, oddly distant. When the guests left, my father's mood shifted. "The wine wasn't chilled properly," he said, his voice low but pointed. "And you didn't refill the hors d'oeuvres quickly enough." Mom nodded, her smile gone. "I'll make sure everything's perfect next time." I watched from the staircase, a lump forming in my throat. Perfect. Everything had already seemed perfect to me. My best friend, Maya, was the first person to suggest something wasn't right. We were sitting in my room one afternoon when she said, "Your mom always seems, I don't know, on edge." "What do you mean?" I asked, surprised. "She just doesn't seem as happy as she looks," Maya said. "Does your dad ever, put a lot of pressure on her?" "No," I said quickly. "They're just busy, that's all." But her words planted a seed of doubt. The summer before I left for college, I overheard an argument between my parents. It wasn't loud, my father never yelled, but his tone was cutting. "You can't even keep the pantry organized," he said. "How hard is it to manage a household?" "I'm sorry," my mother replied softly. "I'll take care of it." I peeked around the corner and saw her standing with her head slightly bowed, like a child being scolded. My father walked away without another word, leaving her to stand there in silence. The image haunted me for days. Even after moments like that, I clung to the belief that my parents' relationship was fine. I told myself that every couple had disagreements, that my father's tone wasn't as bad as it seemed, and that my mother's quiet compliance was just her personality. I didn't want to believe that there could be something darker beneath the surface. My 19th birthday marked the moment everything began to shift. Mom gave me a locket engraved with the words "strong and loved." When I opened it, I saw a tiny picture of the two of us inside. "You're going to do amazing things, Isabel," she said, her voice full of emotion. "Don't let anyone hold you back." Her words struck me as odd. They didn't feel like a generic sentiment, they felt like a plea. That summer, I came home from college and found my mother more withdrawn than ever. She'd lost weight, and her usually impeccable outfits were simpler, more subdued. One evening, I found her sitting in the darkened living room, staring out the window. Mom," I said softly. She turned, her face quickly brightening with a forced smile. "Hi, sweetheart. How was your day?" I wanted to ask her what was wrong, but I didn't know how. While cleaning out the attic one day, I stumbled across an old journal of my mother's. I flipped through it, curious, until a particular entry caught my eye. "Sometimes I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. No matter how hard I try, it's never enough. I wish I could be stronger for Isabel." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My mother, the woman I'd always seen as unshakable, was struggling. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that my father wasn't the man I thought he was. After finding my mother's journal, I couldn't stop thinking about her words. Walking on eggshells. It was a phrase I'd heard before but never associated with my parents. It made me question everything I thought I knew. Had I been blind to what was happening in my own home? I started paying closer attention to their interactions. My father's comments, once things I'd brushed off as normal, took on a different weight. I confided in Maya, the only person I trusted to give me an honest perspective. "Do you think my dad, I don't know, controls my mom?" I asked hesitantly. Maya didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. I've noticed it for years. He's always making little digs at her, and she just takes it." Her certainty shocked me. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I didn't think you'd believe me," she said gently. "You've always defended him." Her words stung, but she was right. Once I started looking, the patterns became impossible to ignore. My father never raised his voice, but his criticisms were constant. If dinner wasn't served exactly on time, he'd comment on how disorganized the household was. If Mom forgot to pick up something from the store, he'd sigh and say, "I'll just do it myself next time." And my mother never pushed back. She nodded, apologized, and moved on. It was as though she'd resigned herself to his demands. One afternoon, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. My mom mentioned wanting to take a weekend trip with her friends. "Do you really think that's a good idea?" my father asked. "The house is a mess, and you're already so busy with work." "I suppose you're right," she replied softly. I realized this was how he controlled her, not with overt demands, but with subtle manipulations that made her doubt herself. I decided to talk to my mother directly. "Mom, are you happy?" I asked one evening as we sat on the couch. She looked startled. "Of course, sweetheart. Why would you ask that?" "You just seem different lately," I said carefully. "Is everything okay with you and Dad?" She hesitated, her smile faltering. "Marriage isn't always easy, Isabel. But we make it work." Her answer didn't satisfy me, but I didn't push further. Feeling frustrated, I turned to the internet for guidance. I searched for signs of emotional abuse and found lists that felt eerily familiar. Asterisk criticism disguised as concern. Asterisk isolating a partner from friends and family. Asterisk dismissing or belittling feelings. The more I read, the more convinced I became that my father's behavior wasn't normal. When I returned to college, I scheduled a session with a counselor, Dr. Bryant, to discuss my concerns. "It sounds like your father's behavior fits the patterns of emotional abuse," Dr. Bryant said after I described what I'd observed. "Your mother may not even realize it, or she might feel trapped." "Trapped?" I asked. "Abusers often make their partners feel like they have no other options," she explained. "It's about control." Hearing those words made everything feel more real, and more urgent. One evening, my mother called me, her voice strained. "Your father and I had an argument," she said. "It's nothing serious, but I thought you should know." "What was it about?" I asked. "He said I wasn't pulling my weight around the house," she admitted. "But I've been so busy with work lately." Her voice trailed off, and I could hear the frustration she was trying to suppress. "Mom, that's not fair," I said. You work just as hard as he does. I know, she said quietly. I know. Over the weekend, I visited Maya and poured out everything I'd learned. You have to do something, she said. I know, but I don't know how, I replied. If I push too hard, I could make things worse. Maya thought for a moment. Maybe you need to help her see it for herself. Sometimes people don't realize they're in a bad situation until someone holds up a mirror. I started small, planting seeds of doubt in my mother's mind. When she mentioned one of my father's criticisms, I said, "That doesn't sound fair, Mom. You do so much for him." When she brushed off one of his dismissive comments, I said, "You deserve to be treated with respect, you know." At first, she deflected, but over time, I saw something shift in her eyes, a flicker of recognition. My mother began to assert herself in small ways. She started taking more time for herself, reading in the evenings, going for long walks, even making plans with friends again. My father noticed. "You've been distant lately," he said one evening. "I'm just focusing on myself a bit more," she replied, her tone calm but firm. Her response surprised me, and, I think, him as well. The turning point came when my mother confided in me. "Isabel, do you think your father is too critical of me?" she asked one evening. I felt a surge of relief. "Yes, Mom, I do," I said gently. "I've noticed it for a long time, but I didn't know how to bring it up." She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I've been trying to convince myself it's normal, but it doesn't feel normal." "It's not," I said. "And you don't have to accept it." Hearing my mother admit her doubts was both a relief and a call to action. For years, I'd watched her put on a brave face, convincing everyone, including herself, that everything was fine. Now, I felt a responsibility to help her see that she deserved more than just fine. But where to begin? The problem wasn't just my father, it was the years of emotional conditioning that had made her doubt her own worth. Maya continued to be my sounding board, offering encouragement and perspective. "Your mom's starting to see the truth," she said. "That's huge. You just have to keep being there for her." I also reached out to Aunt Karen, my mother's sister, who lived in another state. "I've suspected for years that something was wrong," she admitted. "Your mom doesn't talk about it, but I've noticed how she always seems careful around Matthew." Karen offered her support, promising to be there if my mother ever needed a safe space. One weekend, while I was visiting home, I witnessed an argument that solidified my resolve. My father had criticized my mother for forgetting to buy a specific brand of coffee. "You can't even manage the grocery list," he said, shaking his head. "I got everything else," my mother replied, her voice steady but weary. "It's not about the coffee," he snapped. "It's about attention to detail. I shouldn't have to micromanage everything." I couldn't stay silent any longer. "She doesn't need you to micromanage her," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. My father turned to me, surprised. "This doesn't concern you, Isabel." "It does when you're treating Mom like this," I replied, refusing to back down. The tension in the room was palpable, but for the first time, I felt like I was standing on solid ground. After the argument, I found my mother in the kitchen, quietly putting away groceries. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," I replied. "Mom, you don't deserve to be spoken to like that." She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's just how he is. He doesn't mean any harm." "Maybe not," I said. "But that doesn't make it okay." I placed a hand on her arm. "You're worth so much more than this, Mom. Please don't forget that." With Karen's encouragement, I convinced my mother to attend a session with a domestic violence counselor. At first, she was hesitant. "I don't think what I'm going through is serious enough for that," she said. But the counselor, Miss Thompson, gently reframed her perspective. "Abuse isn't just physical," she said. "It's about power and control. From what you've described, your husband has created an environment where you feel small and uncertain. That's not healthy. My mother didn't say much during the session, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind. The tipping point came during a family dinner. My father had been particularly critical that evening, making passive-aggressive comments about everything from the cooking to my mother's work schedule. Finally, my mother put down her fork and said, "Matthew, I need you to stop." The room fell silent. "Stop what?" my father asked, feigning innocence. "Stop criticizing me," she said, her voice steady. "I've spent years trying to make everything perfect for you, but it's never enough. I'm done living like this." My father's face hardened. "I don't know where this is coming from, but I won't sit here and be accused of things I haven't done." "It's not an accusation, it's the truth," I said, jumping in. "We see what you're doing, Dad, and it's not okay." The confrontation left the family in turmoil. My father retreated to his office, slamming the door behind him, while my mother sat at the dining table, visibly shaken. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, you can," I said firmly. "And you don't have to do it alone." Karen called later that evening, offering to come stay with us for a few days. Her presence was a source of comfort, reminding my mother that she had a support system. In the weeks that followed, my mother began asserting herself more. She set clear boundaries with my father, refusing to tolerate his criticism or dismissive comments. At first, he pushed back, accusing her of being overly sensitive and dramatic. But my mother stood her ground, and for the first time, he seemed unsure of how to respond. Meanwhile, I continued to encourage her, reminding her of her strength and worth. One evening, my mother confided in me, "I always thought I had to keep the peace, for your sake and for the family's reputation. But I see now that I was just making excuses." "You were doing your best," I said. "But it's okay to want more for yourself." She nodded, a determined look in her eyes. "I'm ready to make a change, Isabel. I don't know what that looks like yet, but I know I can't keep living like this." My mother's decision to separate from my father wasn't easy, but it was necessary. With Karen's help, she found a temporary apartment where she could take time to reflect and rebuild. The day she left, I helped her pack her belongings. As we loaded the last box into her car, she turned to me and said, "I don't know where I'd be without you." "You'd still be the strong, amazing woman you are," I replied. "I just helped you see it." My father's reaction to the separation was a mix of anger and denial. He called me repeatedly, demanding to know why I'd turned my mother against him. "It's not about me, Dad," I said during one particularly heated call. "It's about how you've treated her. She deserves to be happy." His silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. Though the road ahead was uncertain, my mother's courage inspired me. She began attending counseling sessions regularly, exploring new hobbies, and reconnecting with old friends. Seeing her smile again, truly smile, reminded me of why this fight had been worth it. The house felt strangely quiet after my mother moved out. For years, her presence had been a constant, a calming force that balanced my father's intensity. Without her, the silence was heavy, and my father's mood seemed darker. "Do you think she'll come back?" he asked one evening, as though I could reassure him. "She's doing what she needs to do," I said carefully. "Maybe it's time you think about what you need to do, too." My father didn't reply, and I wondered if he truly understood how much damage he'd caused. My mother and I spoke often during those first weeks. She shared updates about her new apartment, describing it as small but cozy. "It's strange being on my own," she admitted one evening. "But it's also freeing." I could hear the hope in her voice, and it made my chest ache with a mix of pride and sadness. She was finally putting herself first, but I knew how much it had cost her to get to this point. I visited my mother's apartment as often as I could, helping her unpack and decorate. Together, we hung framed photos and arranged bookshelves, turning the space into a reflection of her personality, bright, welcoming, and full of life. One afternoon, as we sorted through boxes, she found an old scrapbook filled with family photos. She paused on a picture of the three of us, taken years ago at a beach vacation. "I stayed for so long because of moments like these," she said quietly. "I wanted to believe we could get back to that." "You're allowed to miss the good parts," I said. "But that doesn't mean you should ignore the bad." Not everyone understood my mother's decision to leave. Some of her colleagues and acquaintances expressed surprise, even disbelief, when they learned about the separation. "But you and Matthew seem so perfect together," one of her coworkers said. "Are you sure you're not overreacting?" My mother shared these comments with me, her frustration evident. "Why do people assume they know what goes on behind closed doors?" she asked. "Because it's easier than accepting that appearances can be deceiving," I said. Her strength in the face of judgment inspired me, but I could see how much it weighed on her. Meanwhile, my father tried to reassert control in subtle ways. He sent my mother texts filled with a mix of apologies and guilt trips. "I know I wasn't perfect, but neither were you. Can't we just move on? You're breaking this family apart." Each message left her shaken, but she stood firm. With the help of her counselor, she crafted measured responses that set clear boundaries. "I deserve respect, Matthew," she replied to one particularly manipulative text. "If you can't offer that, then we have nothing to discuss." Chapter 40, Celebrating Small Wins. As my mother settled into her new life, we celebrated each milestone: her first grocery run without second-guessing her purchases, her decision to take up painting, and even her first dinner party with a few close friends. "It feels strange being celebrated for things that should be normal," she said with a wry smile. "They're not normal for you yet," I replied. "But they will be." Aunt Karen played a vital role in my mother's healing journey. She visited often, filling the apartment with laughter and stories from their childhood. "You've always been the strong one, Lil," Karen said one evening over tea. "You just forgot it for a while." Hearing Karen's perspective helped my mother see herself in a new light. She wasn't a victim, she was a survivor. Watching my mother's transformation inspired me to reflect on my own life. For so long, I'd been consumed by the need to protect her, but now, I realized I needed to prioritize my own growth as well. I joined a campus advocacy group focused on healthy relationships, using my experiences to support others. Sharing my story felt vulnerable, but it also felt empowering. "Your honesty helps people more than you know," Maya said after one meeting. Her encouragement reminded me of the power of connection. One of the most pivotal moments in my mother's journey came when she decided to speak openly about her experience. With the support of her counselor, she wrote an op-ed for a local newspaper, titled "The Strength to Walk Away: Why I Chose Myself." The piece was raw and honest, detailing her journey from denial to empowerment. It quickly gained traction, sparking conversations about emotional abuse and the courage it takes to leave. "I was terrified to put this out there," my mother admitted. "But it feels good to finally tell the truth." Predictably, my father didn't take the article well. He called me furious. "Your mother's dragging our family name through the mud," he said. "Do you know how this makes me look?" "It's not about you, Dad," I replied calmly. "It's about her finding her voice." His indignation was a reminder of how much he valued control, but I refused to let it intimidate me. As time passed, my mother began to build a new support system. She joined a book club, started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, and reconnected with friends she'd lost touch with over the years. Each new connection reminded her that she wasn't alone. "I spent so many years feeling isolated," she said one evening. "I forgot how much love there is in the world." One day, my mother and I visited our old house to collect a few remaining belongings. Standing in the living room, she looked around with a mix of nostalgia and relief. "This house holds so many memories," she said. "But it doesn't feel like home anymore." Her words marked a turning point. She was no longer tied to the life she'd left behind. My mother decided to channel her experiences into advocacy work, partnering with a local nonprofit to raise awareness about emotional abuse. "Helping others makes everything I went through feel meaningful," she said. Her resilience inspired me, and I felt proud to see her turning her pain into purpose. At my urging, my mother and father agreed to meet for a mediated conversation. "I'm not here to assign blame," my mother began. "I just want to set clear boundaries moving forward." Though the conversation was tense, it ended with an understanding that they could coexist peacefully, even if they couldn't reconcile. By the end of the year, my mother was thriving in her new life. She'd found a sense of independence and confidence that I hadn't seen in years. As we celebrated the holidays in her apartment, surrounded by friends and family, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Looking back, I realized that breaking the silence had been the hardest but most necessary step. It had taken courage, persistence, and love to help my mother see her worth. As I stood by her side, I knew we'd both come out stronger, and ready for whatever came next. The months after my mother's separation from my father were filled with a newfound sense of freedom. For the first time, she wasn't walking on eggshells or worrying about meeting someone else's expectations. Her apartment had become a sanctuary, a place where she could simply be herself. One afternoon, as we sat together in her cozy living room, she said, "It's amazing how much lighter I feel. I didn't realize how much weight I was carrying until it was gone." Her words resonated deeply. Seeing her thrive was proof that breaking free was worth it, no matter how hard the journey had been. My mother began rediscovering passions she'd abandoned long ago. She enrolled in a painting class, filling her apartment with canvases of vibrant landscapes and abstract designs. "I used to love painting when I was younger," she told me one evening as we admired her latest piece. "But life got in the way, and I convinced myself it wasn't important." Now, she painted not for anyone else's approval, but simply because it brought her joy. Inspired by her own journey, my mother became a mentor to women navigating similar challenges. She volunteered at a local women's center, offering guidance and support to those seeking to leave abusive relationships. "Every story is different," she said, "but the feelings are the same: fear, doubt, and the hope for something better. If I can help even one person, it makes everything I went through worth it." Her strength and compassion reminded me of the power of community and the importance of breaking the silence around abuse. Watching my mother embrace her independence inspired me to focus on my own growth. I started journaling regularly, reflecting on my experiences and the lessons I'd learned. Writing became a way to process my emotions and find clarity about who I wanted to be. I also became more involved in the advocacy group I'd joined, using my voice to support others and raise awareness about healthy relationships. Each step felt like a declaration of my own resilience, a reminder that I, too, could thrive. Though we were moving forward, there were moments when the past resurfaced. One day, while sorting through an old box of photos, my mother found a picture of our family at a holiday party. In the photo, she was smiling brightly, but her eyes held a hint of sadness I hadn't noticed before. "It's strange," she said, holding the picture up. "Back then, I thought I was happy. I convinced myself that this was just how life was supposed to be. But now you know better," I said, placing a hand on hers. She nodded, her smile genuine this time. "Yes, I do." My mother's separation from my father also allowed her to rebuild relationships with friends and family she'd grown distant from over the years. Aunt Karen became a frequent visitor, and their bond grew stronger with each passing week. "She was always the one who saw through everything," my mother admitted. "I just wasn't ready to hear it back then." Reconnecting with loved ones reminded her, and me, of the importance of surrounding ourselves with people who uplift and support us. Though my father remained distant, there were moments of reflection on his part. He reached out to me one day, asking if we could meet for coffee. "I've been thinking a lot about the past," he said. "I realize now that I wasn't the husband or father I should have been." His admission surprised me, though I approached it with caution. "It's good that you're reflecting," I said. "But the real question is what you're going to do about it." I didn't expect a complete transformation, but it was a step in the right direction. 1 year after my mother moved out, we celebrated her milestone at a small dinner party with close friends and family. As we raised our glasses to toast her courage and resilience, she stood to say a few words. "This year has been one of the hardest and most rewarding of my life," she said. "I've learned that it's never too late to choose yourself, to find happiness, and to rebuild." Her words brought tears to my eyes. She was no longer the woman who lived in fear, she was someone who had reclaimed her power. With her newfound independence, my mother began dreaming about the future. She talked about traveling, starting a small business, and continuing her advocacy work. "I used to think my life was set in stone," she said. "But now, it feels like anything is possible." Her optimism was infectious, and it reminded me that healing isn't just about moving on, it's about moving forward with purpose and hope. As I sat on my mother's balcony one evening, watching the sunset, I reflected on how far we'd both come. The silence that had once dominated our lives was gone, replaced by laughter, connection, and a sense of freedom. "This is just the beginning," my mother said, joining me with a cup of tea. I smiled, knowing she was right. Our story wasn't defined by the struggles we'd faced, it was defined by the strength we'd found in overcoming them. Together, we had built something beautiful, and the future felt brighter than ever.